Welcome to the Thought Decoders channel, where we teach logic, we teach you to think critically, we teach you how to state and to defend your faith. I'm a Christian philosopher, Sean Mixon, the Thought Decoder, and today we are reading Two Powers in Heaven, a study by rabbinic Jew Alan Seagal. Today we're going to start out on page 40. Page 40. And we want to look at where we left off, and let's get into some of this text. So last time we left off, we were looking at a tradition. Alan Seagal notes that there was a tradition to see the two manifestations of God on Mount Sinai and at the sea as being two properties of God, as well as being two manifestations that God presented himself in. Let's see if we can go back and see what he said. Okay. Although this elaboration is quite sophisticated, there are some biblical aspects to it. For one thing, the two locations deduced in Scripture for the doctrine of God's two attributes are both. Okay, here we go. Okay, and I'll just highlight this right here. The complete argument allows that God can appear in different manifestations, either as a just or as a merciful God, or as both, but that it is always the same God, and that he was present in both his manifestations when he gave the Torah to Israel. So the tradition of rabbinic Jews is that God presents himself in two manifestations, and that both of those manifestations were present when God gave the Torah. Right? There was God. There was the young man at the sea. There was the old man on the mountain, right? Fascinating. Let's get into some of this. And so we left off the Makilta of Rabbi Ishmael, in the MRI. Other variations in the Makilta of Rabbi Ishmael should be noted, just as, and that's. Look at this document. It should be noted, just as Exodus 15:3 and Exodus 24:10 cross-reference are introduced as separate but related cases of theophany in the MRI. So Daniel 7:9 is treated as a separate case of the phenomenon of God's changing manifestations, as was suspected in reading the Makilta of Rabbi Simeon B. Yohai. And the Makilta is just a rule for interpreting Scripture. Here are the details of the argument worked out. In the apocalyptic vision ascribed to Daniel, two thrones appear in heaven, which imply two different figures to fill them. After referring to this dangerous idea, the Midrashist has also inserted a specific remedy to the misconception that two powers in heaven are being described by Daniel. In Daniel 7:10, Scripture states that a fiery stream came forth from him, where the singular pronoun shows that only one personage is present, although there may be two manifestations. I guess that's the question. Does the singular use there show one person when you see two distinct persons, like a young one and an older person, or one just comes to, so God comes to himself, right? That doesn't make sense. the one person comes to himself, right? The same person. Or are they distinct persons, but it's one God? The scripture is speaking of distinct persons as both being one. Behold, the Lord thy God is one. Like it says in the Shema. To me, this just fits so well with Christianity. It's just unbelievable. Like their own views, right? So let's look back at this. Where did we leave off? Okay, so he's saying that the pronoun shows that there's only one person present. A further elaboration in the M or I must also be explained. Exodus 24:10 cross-reference was quoted because Exodus 24:11b contained the proof that God was merciful to the Israelites at Sinai. However, the Midrash also makes a special point of quoting Exodus 24:10b and the like of the very heaven for clearness, which is irrelevant to the argument that God is merciful, the point of the proof text. However, this biblical verse contains an anthropomorphic version of Yahweh, probably understood to be to describe a glorious enthronement, that it contains another Merkabah, chariot throne. Description similar to Daniel 7:9 cross-references perhaps to itself enough to explain the reference. However, in this case, the Midrashists must also be alluding to other rabbinic traditions which explain how God's throne could be both constructed of brickwork and be the like of the very heaven for clearness. This possible contradiction in deity's appearance is solved by assuming that when Israel was in bondage, God's Shekinah or presence shared their fate symbolically by resting on the brickwork. But when they were freed, his throne rested on the clear blue heaven. The redactor then must have been reasoning that since the contention under discussion is that God's aspect changed in the various visions he gave to man, the legend of the Shekinah's change of aspect at Exodus 24:10 should be included as well. Okay, so God's aspect and the way he appeared to men changed. And he's saying that this is another rabbinic legend. Okay. Exodus 20, Shekinah's change of aspect at Exodus 24:10 should be included as well. The peroration at the end of MRI has also been expanded over the version in the MRS BY. It comprises a list of biblical passages which combat the idea that two deities rule the cosmos together, with an elaboration of many aspects of God. Okay, with an elaboration of many aspects of God. Keep losing my place. Okay. Which, nevertheless, remain descriptions of only one deity. So I say it comprises a list of biblical passages which combat the idea that two deities rule the cosmos, together with an elaboration of the many aspects of God, which nevertheless remain descriptions of only one deity. So God has aspects. Question will be that definitely raises the question: what is considered an aspect, right? Well, that's considered an aspect. That's not clear what an aspect is here. So he gave to man the legend of the Shekinah. Okay, all right. As in MRSBY, the Makilta of Rabbi Simeon B. Yohai, it appears to be based on Exodus 3:14, the revelation of his name. Okay. Okay, so the revelation of his name is what this is based off of. Okay, although God may be viewed in various aspects, there is a limit to how far one may go in ascribing independent motives to his different hypostases. So it's kind of strange for them to use the word hypostases because it means substance. So it's almost like they're saying that God has different substances. The MRI, in effect, has defined more carefully than MRSBY what the problem of two powers in heaven entails by giving us three different texts from which the heresy can be derived: Daniel 7:9, Exodus 15:3, and Exodus 24:10. Furthermore, it has identified the people who believe in the two powers in heaven as Gentiles. Okay, in the final peroration against the doctrine, it does not know about the reference to the river Arnon, which was in the MRSBY, and adds Isaiah 46:4 to the list of scriptural passages, which may be used as a corrective against the false doctrine. MRI and MRSBY must have a sophisticated legend in common together with some independent development. The last recension of these traditions, PR 21-100b, is very late. It records similar objections against two powers in heaven ascribed. It was something I was going to look up in the notes. I forgot. Let's see, it was 12 different hypostases. Yeah, so let's see what this is saying. The MRSBY introduces these thoughts as another interpretation. It also makes the name of God a part of the explicit commentary by saying the Lord is a man of war. This means he makes battle in Egypt. The Lord is his name. He battles at the sea and is the same at the Jordan and the same at the Arnon, the same in this world, the same as. Okay, so they're saying it comes from DBR something HR. Okay, so so they're listing where that is. Okay, a third generation immoral, Rabbi Hiya B. Abba, 290 to 320 years after Christ's death. Therefore, is later than him. Notice that the midrash is occasioned by Moses' vision of God face to face, confirming that theophany and anthropomorphism are basic issues in the tradition. Moses' special gift in somehow seeing God or his angel, though it may contradict, remains a central preoccupation of Rabbi Levi. Ooh, oh man. So he is admitting that Moses saw God or his angel. First contributes the midrash that God appears in whatever form is appropriate to his action. He uses Exodus 15:3 as his proof text that God appeared as a young man at the sea. Interestingly, What's interesting about this, they have God appearing at the sea, but the verse just says God is a warrior, like a man. God is a man of war, basically. I mean, literally. So it doesn't say anything about God appearing at the sea, but that's the way they interpret it. Interestingly enough, he seems at first not to be interested in Exodus 24:10 cross-reference, which demonstrates somehow, maybe that's not cross-reference, I don't know what that F stands for, which demonstrates elsewhere that God appeared in his merciful form. Rather, he emphasizes the youth age contrast by quoting Job 12:12 to the effect that age denotes wisdom. Hence, was appropriate for God to have appeared in age form on Sinai. This exegesis effectively splits the tradition into two logical aspects. The first only concerning the forms in which God appeared, the second which follows concerning his attitude of grace or anger at each manifestation. To each of the separate strands of the tradition, Rabbi Hiya B. Abba answers in Aramaic rather than Hebrew. That if a heretic says that there are two gods based on Daniel 7:9, one is to remind him that God stated that he is the same at the sea as Sinai. But where did God say that? So that response is assuming their interpretation of those verses, right? But those verses don't seem to be necessarily or even have contextual evidence that's what they're referring to. That's what another rabbi said that they meant. So if the so-called heretic didn't accept the rabbi's authority, then how could there be an argument to him? It's circular reasoning. Here both the Sinai theophany and the Daniel vision are central texts in the second midrash. Rabbi Hiya B. Abba uses Deuteronomy 5:4 as a proof text that all God's faces, that is, his aspects, are present as Sinai. So God has these different aspects. Wow. Exodus 24:10 does not appear, but Rabbi Hiya B. Abba refers to the same theophany given to Moses as it was reported in Deuteronomy instead of Exodus. He also deals with the same troublesome report that the elders saw God. That the elders saw God. All of this leads to the conclusion that this version of the tradition is quite late. The themes of God's appearance in human form have been divided into separate issues in order to deal with each more conveniently and fully, but the relationship to the name of God has grown more obscure. In just 3 passages, then, we have become aware of the development of a tradition over a vast period of time. Traditions with so many different layers present immense dating problems. Each layer can only be dated by approximation. Later, I will show that extra rabbinic writings contain similar traditions, making a first century origin plausible on external grounds. To anticipate only a fraction of the evidence, Philo attests to the pervasiveness and antiquity of the problem of God's appearance and his different aspects. Philo attests to that. Wow. Woo, it's getting good. So this was a problem that the Jewish rabbis were dealing with. They said the pervasiveness and antiquity of the problem of God's appearance and his different aspects. So they're scratching their head, right? They're admitting that it's a problem. That God presents himself as two distinct beings, at least even. But then he comes and says that the Lord our God is one, right? The Lord your God is one, right? So echad, which is the same word that is said in Genesis when it says Adam and knew his wife and they became one flesh. So two persons were one. This is good. It'll get me excited. Too late. So since Philo states that he relies on ancient Jewish tradition, his writings, including those pertaining to the exegesis of the names of God, may indicate the antiquity of the tradition. That Philo knows the issue suggests a possible origin well before the birth of Jesus, but Philo's writings suggest more than a continuing issue. He employs very similar scriptures and suggests the existence of widespread scriptural traditions. Since the rabbis a century later know nothing of him directly and are not indebted to him for their exegesis, yet Philo and the rabbis independently interpret the different names of God both as signifying different figures and as rabbinic. Oh my goodness. I'm so sorry. Oh man, this is waking me up. I was kind of sleepy. So what he's saying is that these rabbis in the Talmud, in the Makilta, and their rules for interpreting Exodus, and they're coming like a century after Philo. But here's Philo. The rabbis don't know Philo, but so you have what's called independent attestation, right? When you have different sources, different authors writing about the same, verifying the same information in the same way, that's called multiple attestation, which establishes historicity. It's a criterion of historicity that is used in New Testament studies and throughout history in general. C.P. McCullough, in his book Justifying Historical Inferences, lists several different tools that the historian uses to establish historicity, and multiple attestation is one of those tools. And so that's what he's demonstrating right here. That's what Alan Seagal is demonstrating, that Philo and the rabbis both independently interpret the different names of God both as signifying different figures and as symbolizing his attributes. Oh, my goodness. So there's a tradition here of the rabbis. This is 200 years after Jesus. It's like, it's crazy. Right? At this point, they were not like the rabbinic Jews of today, right? Who just to try to deny, oh, God is one, and he doesn't present himself, and he doesn't have manifestations, etc., etc. Which they probably won't deny that, but they don't. You don't hear them talking about it, like, right? I've seen many Jews discussing the scripture, and I've never heard them say, "Well, God actually has two manifestations," right? And that the names of God represent two different manifestations. That alone, they're admitting so much, right? So they're admitting that God has these different attributes, and that these attributes of God have different names, right? And Philo attested to that. So did the rabbis, right? Which is phenomenal. That is phenomenal. We can see. Okay, where did I say? I just got so excited I lost my place. Different names of God, both as signifying different figures and as symbolizing his attributes. So it's two different figures, and those figures represent his different attributes, his mercy and his justice. Preliminary indications are, therefore, that many parts of the Jewish community in various places and periods use the traditions which the rabbis claim is an heretical conception of the deity. Oh my God. There it is. There it is. I have to highlight that. Let me pick it up. I don't really like that yellow. So do you see this? He's saying the preliminary indications are therefore that many parts of the Jewish community in various places and periods, because they were still interpreting those names, different names of God, as different figures or aspects or manifestations, whatever you want to call God. Want to call those manifestations. There were two things that Seagal's pointing out here. That you have Philo, who is pre-Christian, so probably 200, 300 years prior to Jesus, prior to these rabbis, describing the problem of these different manifestations of God, describing that these manifestations are given different names, and that these manifestations are believed to represent different attributes of God. This is what the Jewish people believed prior to the rabbinic codification of the Talmud, and after this reaction to Christianity, where they tried to, they suppressed this kind of stuff. Like, you don't hear about this coming from Jewish community, because it just begs the question. Like, it just makes you believe that God is multi-personal, like Christianity. Like, this supports. If you wanted to develop an argument from the best explanation, and you look at the probability, what's the likelihood that you would have this evidence here, given the truth of Christianity, and then what's the likelihood that you would have this evidence if Christianity was false? It's very unlikely, right? If God was just one person who was God, would we expect him to manifest himself and people who look different, like an old man and a young man, which is not even in the scripture? But what's crazy is this is the Jewish tradition. This is their interpretation, and their interpretation supports not their view, the present view, but it supports the Christian view. Like, who's the old man? Well, it looks like a father. Old man's typically a father. Young men's are typically sons, right? Every young man has a father. So this is like a father-son, right? Now, if what if God appeared as a girl or daughter, then that wouldn't support the Christian view. So he's saying that the preliminary indications is that this was spread. This was spread in different places and periods. How do you know different periods? Well, because Philo came hundreds of years, centuries before the rabbis did. But they have the same interpretation. These are different figures. These are different properties of God. And the figures are, and properties are linked. And the different names of God are linked to different figures. And the figures represent different properties. It says, we can see how the two different manifestations of God present in Daniel's vision, might trouble the rabbis. It is not too much to suppose that some kind of argument about contrasting manifestations of God in different theophany texts was known to Philo and used by him, but that it was later opposed by the rabbis, who called other people who espoused that kind of argument two powers heretics. Let's read that again. It is not too much to suppose that some kind of argument about contrasting manifestations of God in different theophany texts was known to Philo and used by him, but that it was later opposed by the rabbis, who called other people who espoused that kind of argument two powers heretics. So he's saying that Philo not only knew about these manifestations of God, but these different views these arguments about the different manifestations of God, but Philo used them. But that those views were later opposed by rabbis. So Seagal is showing some tension between the rabbis, later rabbis of later centuries after Jesus, and prior Jewish beliefs. This is incredible. I mean, it is the most amazing thing I've ever, like being a Christian, this is the most amazing thing I've ever come to know. I've wondered all my life about like the Jewish people, God's people, and wonder why, they didn't accept Jesus. So I kind of thought, well, maybe it's not clear in the Old Testament. So I've been reading the New Testament for pretty much all my life, and now I'm starting to come to study the Old Testament and seeing all this and studying this and being shocked because I've read the Old Testament. I've read them from the rabbinic Jews' eyes. I read it with this belief that the Old Testament only presents this one person that is God, which is the view of rabbinic Jews. But I've read the Old Testament like that all my life. And then when I see these verses, I'm like, how did I miss this? How did I miss it? It's amazing. So, although we see that Philo uses both traditions about different manifestations of God and traditions about his contrasting attributes in his exegetical discussions, the rabbis emphasize the latter and warn against the former. So, he's saying Philo uses both, but the rabbis warn against the manifestations. Why is that? They come later. They only warned about it after Christianity, right? So that's a reaction. That's not based on exegesis of the text. That's based on a reaction to the views of Christians who looked at this and said, "Hey, one of these people is with us. One of these manifestations is with us. Died, came, and was born and became flesh," which they thought was heresy. When you read the New Testament, in every gospel, I wrote down the verses somewhere. Every gospel, when Jesus' trial, they ask him, was he the Son of Man? Right? The Son of Power, the Son of the Blessed One. Right? And then Jesus said, I am. Then Caiaphas rips his clothes. Well, Caiaphas asked him if he was the Son of God. Right? Now, if then Caiaphas said that he blasphemed. So what does Caiaphas' rejection? Right, and we know that this is historical because it has historical. It satisfies the criterion of dissimilarity, right? If some text has something in it that would not support latter beliefs and developments about Christianity, such as that Jesus is God, and Jesus didn't blaspheme because Jesus was God. So for the accusation to be that Jesus blasphemed, that is dissimilar to later traditions of what the church taught. So it's less likely to have been fabricated, and it's more likely to be an authentic objection and scenario within the Bible. But when we look at the objection, the objection implies that Jesus' claim to be the Son of God was blasphemous. So what does that entail? That the Son of God is divine. And now we have this extra biblical evidence that Jews had these views of gods, that there were these different figures, and that these different figures represented different attributes of God. But the latter rabbis denounced it. This is so good. You cannot make this up. So we can see how the two different manifestations of God present and present in Daniel's vision might trouble the rabbis. Why would it trouble them? Because you have two at the same time? What is God trying to teach? Is he trying to teach that there are two different gods? Or that the two are one? Right? Because look, he presents both different people, apparently different people. And then he does say that they are God. Different people are God. Multiple people are God. Or one God. So, what's the conclusion? The conclusion has to be that God has a nature that includes that he is one but multiple persons. Why didn't the rabbis use both? What the scripture says, they get the one part, but then again, look whose interpretation we're addressing. This is the post-Christian rabbis, Jewish believers, right? The pre-Christians, what we're doing like Philo, there are these multiple figures, and so when Jesus is coming, the revelation of Christ comes, and the rejection of Christ comes, which was also prophesied that the Jews would reject him. Who has believed our report, and who had the arm of the Lord been revealed? An arm is attached to the person, right? So it's the Lord's arm. Okay. It is not too much to suppose that some kind of argument about contrasting manifestations of God in different theophany texts was known to Philo and used by him, but that it was later opposed by the rabbis, who called other people who espoused that kind of argument two powers heretics. It is not possible to decide exactly when rabbinic opposition to such doctrine started. For one thing, it is nearly impossible to be sure of the wording of rabbinic traditions before 200 CE, much less before 70 CE, when the rabbis became the leaders of the Jewish community. Most rabbinic traditions. So, what happened in 70 CE? The destruction of the temple. Jesus said, "You see this temple? In 3 days, this temple will be destroyed, but in 3 days I'm gonna raise it back up." Right. And one of the gospels says he was talking about his body. Then another gospel says he was talking about the temple. He pointed to the temple. Right. And this is considered a prophecy of Jesus. He was like, no stone will be left unturned, right? Which you can go to Israel today and see the stones that were destroyed from the temple. But these rabbis, they took over because the priests were over in Israel prior to this. Priests and the Pharisees, the rulers, right? The legal rulers, they were over the law. Politicians and lawyers, basically who they were. Most rabbinic traditions, at least as we have them, were written subsequently. So we cannot blithely assume that the rabbinic reports date from the Second Commonwealth. However, with Philo's evidence, we have reason to suppose their Jacob Neusner, Traditions of the Pharisees, claims that it was the academics, the academies after 70 that developed the forms of recording traditions. This argument has much merit, and even if there are exceptions to this rule, it is best to earn them instead of conveniently assuming that any passage is early. Traditions of the Pharisees. Write that one down. I was told that when you read, you get, whatever you read, the author is going to mention other books for further study, and you write those down. And I see that that's true. I typically watched a lot of lectures and listened to, and read essays when I was reading actively, but I typically did not read entire books. But I'm glad I'm doing this study. I'm glad you're joining with me because we're doing it together. It's a new level in my scholarship, and I'm just so enjoying this. I'm so enjoying this. Let's keep going. However, with Philo's evidence, we have reason to suppose their antiquity. Furthermore, some attempts at dating are possible. We can be sure that the root argument is quite ancient. Furthermore, some attempts at dating are possible. We can be sure that the root argument is quite ancient. This is because the doctrine of the two attributes, MDTWT, of God is important to the rabbinic defense against the argument that God has two manifestations. Yet the doctrine about the two attributes of God in the text under consideration is not quite consonant with Orthodox version. Okay, so he's saying there's dissimilarity. So Exodus 15:3 contains the name Yahweh, which signifies mercy in the rabbinic system, while the sense of the passage requires the aspect of justice to be present. Yahweh is a man of war. Exodus 24:10 contains the construct form of the name Elohim, which signifies justice in the rabbinic system, while the interpretation requires that God show mercy, and they saw the God of Israel yet remained alive. The rabbis would certainly not have discussed such a contradictory passage had it not already become a crux interpretationist, crux interpretationist on independent grounds. Whether or not the Makilta reflects an early rabbinic notion of the identification of attributes with the names of God, or merely heretical understanding of such a tradition, the fact that it differs from the Orthodox tradition allows us one conclusion: the tradition must have preceded the firm fixing of the rabbinic doctrine of the two attributes of God. Which tradition is he talking about, though? Let's keep reading. After the tradition was fixed, no rabbi would have considered the consequences of this alternative identification of divine names without noting that he knew what his forebears had believed. It is therefore probable that the doctrine was characteristic of the heretics themselves, since no one believes the rabbis knew of Philo. These heretics must have known of an exegetical tradition like Philo's. The date of the origin for the rabbinic doctrine of the two attributes of God has been the subject of some controversy. A. Morstein tried to maintain that R. Meyer and Rabbi Simeon B. Yochai, middle 2nd century, were the first to use the terms. He suggested that the MDT HTWB and MDT HPWR and NWT synonyms for the accepted doctrine found in some Tanaitic documents were actually the technical terms of an earlier doctrine and were rabbinic and were discarded by the rabbis under the pressure of the Gnostic menace. Interesting. This much has been widely accepted. So there was an early doctrine, and this doctrine was rejected. Under the pressure of the Gnostic menace, this much has been widely accepted. He also suggested that the surviving rabbinic doctrine was not antique and had been deliberately altered from an earlier one out of political and apologetical motives. What? So, what is the old rabbinic doctrine of God? It's the name of this book. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. He even tried to prove that traces of an earlier Philonic correlation of divine names and attributes were still to be found in some rabbinic texts. For instance, he tried to show that Akiba was unaware that Elohim could have the implication of judge. However, that conclusion is too hasty. The same passage may be interpreted to indicate that Rabbi Akiba, was aware of the standard doctrine. That would mean that the standard rabbinic doctrine could have been developed even earlier than Rabbi Akiba. What is more important, the Orthodox doctrine was massively developed by rabbis like Rabbi Simeon N.R. Meyer only a few years after Akiba's death. The Orthodox doctrine was developed. Now, since more time we have had to become more skeptical of attributions to Tanaitic sages. Though they are not necessarily later, the attributions themselves cannot be the final proof of the Tanaitic date. So far, we know only that rabbinic use of justice and mercy arguments to counter heresy were attributed unselfconsciously to Akiba or earlier. We should see that some of the attributions are likely to be accurate. The heated debates about mercy and justice are entirely appropriate. Justice and mercy. Does Paul talk about that? That's a question. That's interesting. If Paul mentioned this, then Paul is after post Philo, so that he would have been closer to that tradition. Let's see. The heated debates about mercy and justice are entirely appropriate to Gnostic menace of the early. And middle 2nd century. We would have to wait for the rabbinic evidence to see that some Jews discussed such doctrines as early as Philo. Morgenstein has been severely criticized and largely dismissed because he maintained that the rabbis actually used the Philonic identification of divine names, only changing to the received tradition in the face of Gnostic opposition of the 2nd century. As I tried to indicate above, his critics were right to question his arguments in several places. There is not sufficient evidence to reach his conclusion, but having dismissed his arguments about a prior rabbinic formulation of the doctrine of God's two attributes, Morgenstein's critics failed to come to terms with the larger questions which he raised. The relationship between Philonic and rabbinic tradition of the names of God. The ancient terms for the attribute of goodness, and attribute of punishment do parallel Philo's normal vocabulary to discuss God's powers. Furthermore, the important point is not the disagreement between the rabbis and Philo over the interpretation of the names of God, but their fundamental agreement that God is the author of both justice and mercy. Both would say that God does mercifully even when he is administering strict justice. It is the mixture that is important. That is certainly the moral of the passage in the Makilta as well. Furthermore, that is exactly the issue over which the received terminology of the rabbinic doctrine was formulated. This would suggest that Hellenistic and Palestinian Judaism were not separated by as wide a gap as is usually maintained. But for now, it is not germane to discuss how the similarity came about. Our problem is the date of the traditions. We have already seen that the justice and mercy traditions were added onto the basic Makilta argument about a man-like hypostasis of God in order to defeat the heretical implication that there is more than one God. Rabbinic literature attributes the debate over mercy and justice to Bar Akiba and his successors of the mid-2nd century. The received vocabulary for discussing such questions did not develop until shortly later, according to these reports. Furthermore, the tradition now under scrutiny in the Makilta seems to be part of the earlier stage of that discussion, since it does not use the standard vocabulary. The next serious question which must be answered is, can the Mishrashic attribution to the great rabbis of the 2nd century be trusted? This can only be answered by comparing these traditions with others of that period. First traditions can be compared with others attributed to our Akiba and his circle. That exercise can increase our confidence that a mid-2nd century dating is possible. Finally, we must look for evidence outside of the Midrash that the date can be maintained. Then we can reach some confidence that the two strands of the tradition, the appearances of God and the attributes of God, were joined in the mid-2nd century. Some rabbinic traditions ascribed to Akiba, Rabbi Akiba, make it possible that the period of his lifetime and immediately afterward was the beginning of the written record of such battles. They even suggest why the issue of mercy and justice became so important. One passage says his throne was fiery flames, and another passage says until thrones were placed, and one that was ancient of days did sit. There is no contradiction. One throne for him and one for David. And this is the view for Rabbi Akiba, said Rabbi Yossi the Galilean to him. Akiba, how long will you treat the divine presence as profane? Rather, one for justice and one for grace. Did he accept this explanation from him, or did he not accept it? Come and hear. One for justice and one for grace. This is the view of Rabbi Akiba. These two rabbis were perplexed by the seeming contradiction in the verses. In one place, more than one throne is indicated by the plural form of the noun. In another place, God's throne was fiery flames implies only one throne. Does this mean that the Son of Man in the next verse was enthroned next to God? Rabbi Akiba affirms the possibility, stating that the other throne was for David. Akiba must be identifying the Son of Man with the Davidic Messiah. Nor was Rabbi Akiba alone in the rabbinic movement in identifying the figure in heaven as the Messiah. There is some evidence that Judaism contained other traditions linking these verses in Daniel with the Messiah. 22. There are reports of rabbinic exegesis of Daniel 7:9, which grant the Messiah the title Son of a Cloud. The use of Bar Nasha in Jewish Aramaic, an Aramaic approach to the Gospel and Acts. Let's write that one down. An Aramaic approach to the gospel and Acts. Amazing. Okay, yet the outcome, however, Rabbi Akiba's interpretation, however plausible Rabbi Akiba's interpretation, it is opposed by his colleague Rabbi Yossi, who explicitly states that the throne is for a divine rather than a messianic figure. It is not clear that Akiba would have seen the two categories as contradictory. Yet, the outcome of that controversy was that Rabbi Akiba agreed that the two thrones in heaven should symbolize the two aspects of God's providence, His mercy and His justice. This, like they get so close and just don't see it. It's so funny. I mean, I guess it's not funny, but for them to say, "Look, it's for a Messiah," and someone else says, "No, it's for a divine person." Well, what if the Messiah was divine? Then both of them would have been right. I'm just saying, like, it's, you would think. I mean, but okay. All right, His mercy. God is viewed as sitting on one throne when judging mercifully and on the other when judging by strict justice. Are you kidding me? That is dumb. Is that the interpretation? So God just gets up and, hey, he saw two thrones. And this doesn't even explain the context of Daniel. Daniel said this man, one like the Son of Man, approached the throne of God, and to him was given a dominion and kingdom forever, and all the nations served him. Like that sounds like power. If God is giving him power in heaven, right, then that's divine authority as opposed to earthly authority. So the Davidic Messiah, was he a divine Messiah as well? He was given authority on earth, but what about heaven? This man comes to God, right? So that's a divine authority. His mercy and His justice. God is viewed as sitting on one throne when judging mercifully, and on the other when judging by strict justice. It is 49. Significant that a central figure in the rabbinic movement like Rabbi Akiba was alleged to have proposed messianic interpretations of Daniel 7:9. Ironically, he subsequently reconsidered those opinions by substituting an opinion in which both figures in heaven were seen to be divine. So he went from saying this is the Messiah to saying that both figures were divine. This is Rabbi Akiba. The corrective to the messianic interpretation is to claim that the verse referred to God's aspects of mercy and justice. Since messianism and Son of Man speculations are characteristic of the Bar Kokhba period, and earlier, both the mercy and justice aspects of the tradition, as well as Daniel 7:9 traditions, could have become centrally important to rabbinic discussions in the middle of the 2nd century. The atmosphere of that time is a plausible setting, even though no text so far quoted unimpeachable evidence of the antiquity of the traditions, and no one would suggest these are Akiba's actual words. Since Akiba died as a martyr as a result of the failure of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and since he was known to have supported Bar Kokhba's messianic claim, it is not surprising that the tradition reports that he recanted his views. But since the tradition comes to us only in a later text, we must be prepared to accept the probability that at the alternate interpretation of Daniel 7:9 namely that the two thrones were for mercy and justice, was a later addition, ascribing the orthodox interpretation to a great rabbinic leader whom time had proven wrong. Thus, the messianic controversy over Daniel 7:13 is probably from Akiba's time. The mercy justice revision is probably from his students. However, if Akiba's messianic interpretation of the passage is rejected, it is clear that other groups would also have been rejected if they went even further than Akiba, not only ascribing a messiahship to the second figure in the Daniel vision, but also ascribing divine or angelic stature to the figure. Both apocalyptic Jews and Christians can be shown to combine the angelic or divine interpretations of the passage with their messianic candidate. Jews similar to Philo, who did not often talk about the Daniel vision, but did give special authority to a second angelic or metaphysical manifestation of God in heaven, could be said to have affirmed a second power. It seems possible that any and all of these groups could be the targets of the charge. At any rate, it is important to note that the exegesis involved believing in two complementary powers, not two opposing powers, thus ruling out Qumran sectarians and extreme Gnostics as the originators of the heresy. If the doctrine of God's two attributes is used as a remedy to messianism shortly after the time of Rabbi Akiba, the tradition of the Shekinah change of aspect is also portrayed as a favorite subject of the sage. The tradition of Shekinah's empathy with Israel in bondage and in freedom is frequently found in Midrash, together with many traditions attributed to Rabbi Akiba. For instance, he discusses 2 Samuel 7:23. Alrighty, we will stop here. Again, this is a fascinating study. I'm so glad you can join us. This is a fascinating study. Again, I'm so glad you can join us. I'm Sean Mixon, the Thought Decoder, and right now we are reading Alan Seagal, a Jewish professor of Jewish studies. We're reading his book, Two Powers in Heaven, where he establishes the tradition of a belief in two powers within Judaism prior to Christianity. This is exciting because it supports the view that this is not just something that just was ad hoc and made up by Christians, but that there was a prior tradition that supported these views. Thanks for joining us here, where I teach you logic, I teach you to think critically, and how to defend and to state your faith articulately. So thank you for your time. Until next time, remember to